Hello, weary traveller. I am the Lonely Knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the forgotten plagues of the Middle Ages. Scourges that were every bit as merciless as the Black Death, yet remain hidden in the shadow of its name. I will guide you through what truly happened in those times, the struggles, the faith, the hunger, and the resilience that shaped the lives of those who came before us. Now, make yourself comfortable, for the story is about to begin. I often find myself wondering, where are you listening from tonight? And what hour of the day finds you as my voice reaches you? I remember the weight of silence that fell upon Europe when the Black Death first arrived in 1347. From the ports of Sicily to the northern reaches of England, death moved swifter than any army, carried by ships and trade routes. It is said that nearly half of Europe's people perished in only a handful of years. Families were erased, villages left deserted, and the tolling of church bells became the rhythm of daily life. No knight, no peasant, no cleric could stand apart from its reach. The fear it inspired was unlike any other. People saw it not as mere sickness, but as divine retribution. Priests spoke of sin and wrath, urging confession before the inevitable end. Some turned to flagellation, believing pain might cleanse the soul. Others abandoned faith altogether, convinced God had forsaken them. In towns and cities, the stench of bodies piled in mass graves mingled with incense carried through desperate processions. The soul of Christendom trembled before an unseen enemy. Commerce itself withered as swiftly as the people. Markets emptied, trade routes closed, and fields lay untended. The shortage of labour brought sudden shifts in the balance of power between lord and serf. Those who survived often found their work newly valued, and with it came a chance to demand more than ever before. Yet prosperity sat uneasily beside grief. Every gain was marked by the memory of neighbours lost and loved ones gone. I saw how knowledge faltered too. Physicians bound by old humours and ancient texts could not explain what unfolded before their eyes. They wore talismans, burned herbs, and spoke of corrupted air. None of it stemmed the tide. The beaked masks that came to symbolise the plague were little more than hollow hope. Wisdom failed, and the authority of healers weakened, as even kings and abbots fell in their chambers, gasping and blotched. Whole monasteries were silenced. The chants that had filled their cloisters ceased when monks succumbed in great numbers. Libraries, once guarded by steady hands, grew cold and empty. The loss of so many clerics left parishes untended, sacraments delayed, and faith shaken. In some places, children grew up without baptism, the dead were buried without rites, and the Church's promise of eternal order cracked beneath the weight of despair. The Black Death also shifted the rhythm of war. Armies lost more to pestilence than to blades. Campaigns faltered as soldiers collapsed in their tents before any battle could be joined. The 100 Years' War itself bore the scars of plague, forcing truces, retreats, and sudden voids of power. Death was indiscriminate, striking knights in armour and archers alike, proving no earthly valour could shield against it. Cultural life darkened in reflection. The dance macabre emerged in art and stone, skeletons leading kings and peasants hand in hand. Sermons thundered about mortality, reminding all that no station could bargain with the grave. Plays and carvings carried this message across villages and towns. Life was fleeting, and death's embrace unescapable. In every mural and chant, I could see the shadow of the plague, stretching over generations yet unborn. Even as centuries passed, the Black Death remained the measure against which every illness was judged. Later epidemics were recalled in its memory, chroniclers noting how they echoed the terror of those years. Its spectre shaped not only medicine but law, society, and belief. And though time dulled the sharpness of grief, the shadow of that calamity lingered in every whisper of disease that followed, reminding mankind of its fragility before forces unseen. Long before my own century, there was a scourge that cast its mark upon the memory of Christendom, the plague of Justinian, It struck in the year 541, first sweeping through the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Chroniclers like Procopius wrote of corpses piled so high that burial became impossible, and the emperor himself fell ill though he survived. Half the city is said to have perished, the hum of trade silenced, and the grandeur of the empire brought low by unseen forces. That story endured, a warning carried across generations. In monasteries and schools of the Middle Ages, the tale of that catastrophe was told and retold. Scholars believed it had been sent as a judgment upon mankind's pride. The memory of it lived not only in parchment, but in the whispered fears of villagers centuries later. When new plagues emerged, many compared them to Justinian's pestilence, convinced that the wrath of God was recurring in cycles of punishment. The past was never truly past in the medieval mind. The scale of the devastation left marks that outlived the empire itself. Entire provinces were depopulated, harvests rotted in fields, and soldiers vanished from the ranks. The Byzantine dream of reconquering the West faltered, for armies cannot march without men. In this way, the disease shaped the course of history as surely as any battle. Medieval writers often spoke of it as the moment when decline began, the hand of fate pressing hard upon the empire's crown. Europe carried those echoes into its own age of suffering. When the Black Death arrived centuries later, it was often spoken of as the second coming of Justinian's plague. The stories written by Procopius and others were drawn upon, their words giving language to the horrors unfolding anew. The past provided a grim mirror, and many believed that the sins of their time had awakened the same fury their ancestors had known. Religious reflection deepened around these memories. Priests taught that pestilence did not fade with time, but lingered in God's storehouse, released when people strayed too far from righteousness. To them, Justinian's calamity was not an ancient tale, but a living presence, proof that divine justice waits and watches. In processions, hymns were sung to saints who had supposedly interceded during that earlier plague, showing how memory intertwined with devotion. Even the measures of defense were shaped by those old recollections. Medieval rulers studied accounts of how Constantinople had burned incense and closed its ports. Though the science was flawed, the instinct to protect cities through control of movement remained. In Italy and France, councils cited the Byzantine experience when debating whether to bar foreign merchants or quarantine ships. The shadow of Justinian stretched invisibly into these decisions. I have walked past ruins where villages once stood, their silence reminding me how fragile life becomes when disease strikes. The chronicles of Justinian's time spoke of deserted fields and empty homes, and I saw the same during my journeys in plague-ridden Europe. Across centuries, the patterns repeated. Life built with toil, then undone by breath and fever. The bond between ages lies in that shared sorrow. The legacy of Justinian's plague is not only in numbers lost, but in the memory it carved into the medieval soul. It became the first great warning, a story that shaped how later generations understood every pestilence that came. When people in my time whispered about God's anger, they often carried the voice of Procopius in their words, proving that the terror of one age can instruct and haunt the next. What many forget is that the great pestilence did not vanish after its first storm. It returned again and again, striking Europe with cruel regularity. In 1361, only a decade after the first devastation, another outbreak swept across towns and villages. People called it the Second Pestilence, and its blows were felt most heavily by those who had been spared the first. Whole families who once believed themselves blessed were suddenly broken. Death's shadow lingered, refusing to release its grip on the continent. The wave of 1361 to 1362 struck with such force that it earned the name Pestilence of Children. Many of the young, born after the first great mortality, had no defences against the plague. Chroniclers wrote of empty schools and churchyards filled with small graves. The loss created a deep wound in the spirit of Europe, for the hope of renewal rested in youth, and that hope was cut down. Parents lived to see their children buried, a sorrow repeated in town after town. Only a few years later, in 1369, The plague rose once more, and again in the 15th century, the cycle continued. It seemed to come with the rhythm of generations, as if every 20 years or so the spectre reappeared. Each recurrence left cities weaker, populations reduced, and economies strained. Unlike a storm that passes, this was more like a tide, retreating for a time, only to surge back with relentless certainty. No one could predict its next return, and that uncertainty gnawed at the heart. The social cost of these cycles was immense. Fields were left fallow, for labourers perished faster than they could be replaced. Entire villages vanished, their names erased from records as survivors sought refuge elsewhere. Town walls crumbled without repair, and churches remained half-built, their masons claimed by disease. The land itself bore witness to the repeated onslaught, scarred by abandonment and decay. What had once been steady progress now faltered into stumbles of survival. Faith also bore the weight of these waves. At first, people believed they had been tested once and spared. But when the pestilence returned, their certainty dissolved. Priests struggled to console their flocks, for prayers that seemed answered proved fleeting. Some clung more fiercely to penitence, while others lost trust in holy intercession. Each recurrence deepened doubt, and whispers spread that perhaps God's punishment was unending, or that mankind's sins were beyond redemption. I remember hearing merchants in taverns speak with dread of the next outbreak. They avoided certain roads, fearing the unseen contagion. Trade fairs dwindled, and with them the lifeblood of commerce. Ports fell silent, for sailors carried not only goods, but death itself. The rhythms of trade, once vibrant across Europe, became erratic and fragile, reshaped by fear. The very lifelines of connection turned into veins of poison, binding cities together through sickness, as much as through exchange. Art and memory recorded these cycles in lasting form. Manuscripts showed illustrations of plague returning like a rider, striking again and again. Chroniclers kept careful lists of dates, noting each recurrence with sorrow. Generations grew up not with the memory of one disaster, but of several. For a child in the 15th century, it was not unusual to hear elders recall multiple waves, each one distinct, each one carving new graves into the soil of Europe. What the first Black Death began, these later waves continued, reshaping not just demography, but the very soul of the Middle Ages. Fear became a constant companion, and resilience a hard-earned necessity. Europe learned that survival was not a single trial, but an endurance through cycles of loss. These waves etched themselves into the memory of towns and families alike, ensuring that no one who lived in those centuries could ever think of plague as a closed chapter. When I look back upon the years that followed the first outbreak, one memory remains carved deeper than others. The mortality that swept across Europe in 1361 and 1362. Unlike its predecessor, which struck all without distinction, this scourge seemed to choose the young. Parents watched helplessly as children sickened and died within days, entire households silenced. Chroniclers named it the pestilence of children, and their words carry the weight of unspeakable grief. It was as though the continent's very future was being cut away. The numbers alone cannot capture the sorrow. In England, France, and the German lands, villages that had survived the first Black Death were hollowed out once more. Churchyards filled quickly, and the wails of mothers echoed from town to town. Some historians believe those spared in 1347-1351 lacked immunity when plague returned. Others suggest the disease shifted in form, striking in ways unfamiliar to the healers of the day. Whatever its cause, the pain was undeniable, for youth bore the brunt of its cruelty. What made this mortality distinct was its generational blow. Many of the elders who survived the first outbreak had pinned their hope on their sons and daughters to rebuild shattered lives. Yet when the pestilence returned, it was these very children who fell. The promise of renewal died with them. Families that had clung to faith now found themselves stripped of consolation as graves multiplied and laughter disappeared from hearths. The legacy of despair ran deeper than stone and parchment. I recall how chroniclers described reinfections, the strange sight of men who had endured the earlier plague only to die in the second. Such accounts shook the belief that survival granted safety. Suddenly, no one could feel secure. The thought that the scourge might return endlessly eroded confidence in medicine, prayer, and even the order of the world. A pall of fatalism spread, and with it, the rhythm of daily life faltered further. The economic wound was severe. With children gone, the flow of inheritance was disrupted, leaving estates without heirs and crafts without apprentices. Whole trades risked extinction in certain towns, their knowledge buried alongside the young who might have carried it forward. Rural communities shrank, fields went untilled, and the burden of labour fell heavily on dwindling shoulders. It was a collapse not just of bodies, but of continuity itself. Priests and monks, though trained to console, struggled with this sorrow. They preached of divine testing and urged penitence, yet their own voices often broke with grief. Records tell of convents losing nearly all their novices, monasteries deprived of young recruits. Religious institutions aged without renewal, their future weakened alongside the laity. It was as though even the spiritual lifeblood of Europe thinned under this relentless affliction. Art and memory bore witness. In manuscripts of the time, one finds images of skeletal figures seizing children from their mothers' arms, a grim reflection of reality. Songs and laments spoke of vanished youth, and communities enshrined the memory of lost generations in prayer. The sorrow was too vast to ignore, shaping the imagination of the people as deeply as any sermon. Each death left an imprint not only on families, but on culture itself. The pestilence of 1361–62 ensured that the trauma of the Black Death did not fade, but deepened. By striking the young, it left scars that lasted decades, making recovery slow and uncertain. In the silence of emptied homes, Europe was forced to confront its own fragility anew. The loss of so many children was more than a tragedy of the moment. It was a wound that reshaped how the continent remembered suffering, and how it braced for the next blow. I cannot forget how the year 1485 marked the arrival of a terror known as the sweating sickness. It came suddenly, first observed after the Battle of Bosworth, and spread quickly through the streets of London and beyond. Unlike the plague, its signs were different. Violent chills, raging fevers, and sweat that drenched the body until death arrived in less than a day. Men who seemed healthy at dawn were dead before nightfall. Its swiftness alone was enough to unnerve even the bravest souls. The disease struck all classes, and in that lay its peculiar dread. Nobles fled their estates just as commoners abandoned their homes, for rank offered no shield. Records tell of Parliament being dismissed, universities emptied, and towns scattered in fear. The sickness seemed to single out strong young men, a cruel twist that robbed families of their heirs. In such uncertainty, the bonds of society loosened, for trust could not survive when breath itself betrayed. The outbreaks returned again and again, 1508, 1517, 1528, and finally in 1551. Each wave deepened confusion rather than offering answers. Physicians confessed ignorance, trying bloodletting, charms, and herbal remedies with no success. The suddenness of death left little time for prayer, confession, or burial rites. Families could barely comprehend the loss before another member collapsed. It was unlike the plague in rhythm, but equal in terror, leaving the Tudor age in constant apprehension. One of the most dreadful accounts speaks of the epidemic of 1528, when the disease leapt across the sea to continental Europe. Hamburg, Antwerp, and other cities trembled as the English malady reached their gates. Yet curiously, it never became as widespread outside England as it was within. To this day, its precise cause remains a mystery, though some suspect a form of hantavirus carried by rodents. For those who lived then, explanation mattered little beside the reality of empty houses. In Tudor London, fear reshaped life. The court of Henry VIII itself fled whenever the sweat appeared, abandoning the capital for countryside manners. Even the king was known for his dread of it, shifting from palace to palace in search of safety. Servants were dismissed, gatherings banned, and the very heart of power reduced to anxious watchfulness. For a monarch who styled himself mighty, here was a foe invisible and ungovernable. What distinguished this sickness from others was its pace. The plague, though swift, often gave days of warning, but the sweat granted no mercy. It was as if time itself collapsed. Morning laughter turned to evening silence. In that brevity, it struck at the certainty of human order. Priests had no chance to administer last rites, and burial grounds filled with those taken too quickly for ritual. Faith itself reeled before the haste of such a killer. I walked through towns where shutters were barred and hearths cold, the sickness having passed like a storm. Survivors spoke in hushed tones, their voices filled with disbelief that so many had perished in so little time. The fear remained long after the fevers ceased, for no one knew when it might return. Unlike famine or war, it left no scars on the land, only on the memory of those who endured its sudden cruelty. The sweating sickness lingers in the annals of history as one of England's darkest afflictions. Though its name is scarcely remembered compared to the Black Death, those who lived beneath its shadow knew its dread intimately. It reminded all that death could come not only by sword or starvation, but by a sweat that poured life away in a single day. Its mystery endures, as does the echo of terror it once spread across the realm. Among all the afflictions that haunted the Middle Ages, leprosy carried with it a burden beyond the body. It was not only disease but exile, for the afflicted were cast out from the world of the healthy. Slow in its progress, it numbed limbs, disfigured faces, and hollowed voices into whispers. Yet it was the fear it inspired that weighed most heavily. To be named a leper was to be declared dead while still breathing, marked as unfit for the company of one's kin. I recall how towns built leprosaria, houses where sufferers were confined apart from society. They were often placed on the outskirts, near roads but far from markets, ensuring that the afflicted lived at the margins of community life. In France, England, and the German lands, thousands of such houses stood. The church oversaw many of them, offering spiritual consolation even as it reinforced separation. The ringing of a bell by a leper became a sound of warning, a signal of distance. Medieval law made this exclusion harshly visible. In some regions, lepers underwent a ritual declaring them dead to the world. Dressed in grave-like garments, they lay before the altar as priests read prayers over them, sealing their exile. They were forbidden to enter taverns, touch food in markets, or walk barefoot on common roads. Such decrees sought not only to protect health, but to reinforce the boundary between pure and impure, safe and unsafe, blessed and cursed. The stigma was fed by religious interpretation. Many believed leprosy was punishment for sin, a visible mark of inner corruption. Some preachers likened the leper's body to the decay of the soul. Yet paradoxically, others saw them as sharing in Christ's suffering, and caring for them was seen as a holy duty. The duality of scorn and compassion shaped how society approached the afflicted, torn between fear and pity. One cannot overlook the social devastation it caused. To lose one's family, work, and place in society while still alive was a death in itself. Some lived in small communities of lepers, bound together by necessity. They formed their own chapels, gardens, and rules, a fragile mirror of the world they had been forced to abandon. In those spaces, sorrow mingled with resilience, and life persisted even in the shadow of rejection. Medical knowledge of the time offered little relief. Physicians described the disease, yet had no cure to propose. Treatments included baths, ointments, and prayers, but none reversed the slow march of the affliction. Its spread was misunderstood, and fear grew out of that ignorance. Only in later centuries would the truth be uncovered, that the disease was far less contagious than once believed. But in my time, fear was a master more powerful than fact. The The sight of lepers on the road left deep impressions on all who passed. Wrapped in cloaks, with faces hidden, they walked with staffs and bells to keep others away. Children clung to their mothers at the sound. Merchants crossed to the other side, and priests murmured prayers as though to ward off misfortune. The presence of even a single leper could alter the rhythm of a market square or the path of a pilgrimage. Leprosy's impact on medieval life was not measured in sudden deaths like the plague, but in years of separation and sorrow. It reshaped laws, architecture, and even the imagination of Christendom. For centuries, the fear of becoming untouchable haunted the minds of all, a reminder that disease could not only destroy the body, but banish the soul from the embrace of community. That shadow of exclusion weighed as heavily as death itself. Years before the Black Death arrived, Europe endured a misery that softened the ground for later calamity, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Relentless rains ruined harvests, turning fields into swamps and rotting grain before it could ripen. Bread became scarce, and hunger gnawed at both peasant huts and noble halls. In many towns, prices soared beyond reach, and starvation stalked the poor with merciless patience. Those years taught Europe how fragile its survival truly was, even before plague made its entrance. The weakness of the body bred further suffering. Malnutrition opened the way for disease, and epidemics of dysentery and pneumonia spread quickly through weakened villages. People turned to eating whatever they could find: roots, acorns, and even the flesh of horses and dogs. Chroniclers speak of corpses lying unburied on roadsides, too many to carry away. With every passing season, despair deepened, and the very order of Christendom seemed to fray under hunger's weight. The famine struck hardest at children and the elderly. These most vulnerable collapsed first, leaving families torn apart. Many peasants, unable to feed their kin, fled their homes to seek food in distant towns, only to find scarcity everywhere. The social bonds of trust began to unravel, as neighbors hoarded what little they had, and markets turned violent with desperate crowds. Survival became a solitary struggle, stripping life of its communal strength. Rulers attempted to intervene, but their efforts faltered against the scale of nature's cruelty. Edward II of England imposed price controls on grain, yet such measures could not conjure wheat from flooded fields. Across France and the Low Countries, officials tried to organize relief, but transport was slow and supplies meager. Armies, too, found themselves weakened, their campaigns cut short by empty stomachs. Political authority stood diminished, unable to shield its people from hunger's reach. In the monasteries, monks recorded the grim details. They wrote of barns left empty, of pilgrims collapsing on the road, of prayers rising in vain for fair weather. Some saw the famine as punishment for sin, a prelude to greater chastisements. Others whispered darker tales, of parents driven to unspeakable acts in order to survive. Whether all such accounts were true or born of fear, the despair they reflect was unmistakable, echoing across the parchment of the age. The famine also reshaped agriculture. With so many cattle perishing from disease, herds dwindled, and the loss of draft animals reduced the ability to plough fields in later years. Grain varieties shifted, diets altered, and communities grew wary of dependence on a single crop. Lessons learned in hunger guided decisions for decades to come, though always haunted by the memory of how little control mankind truly had over the skies above. I have seen ruins of villages that never recovered from those lean years. Abandoned homes, crumbling walls, and fields reclaimed by forest tell of places where hunger's hand pressed too firmly. The scars of famine are not as visible as those of war, yet they are etched into the silence of landscapes where once there was life. They remind the traveller that death by want can be as final as death by sword. The Great Famine stands as a shadowed precursor to the plagues that followed. It weakened bodies, unsettled societies, and prepared the ground for devastation yet to come. When the Black Death struck a generation later, it found a Europe already bruised by hunger, its resilience diminished. In this way, famine and disease became partners in sorrow, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of the Middle Ages. There were times when suffering came not from a plague carried by rats or the air, but from bread itself. Rye, the grain of the poor across much of Europe, could harbour a deadly fungus known as ergot. When consumed, it poisoned the body, twisting limbs in convulsions, causing hallucinations, and blackening flesh until it withered away. People called it St. Anthony's fire, for the pain burned as though the skin itself had been set aflame. Whole villages knew its torment, struck not by pestilence from abroad, but by their daily meal. The outbreaks were most common in France and the Rhineland, where rye grew in abundance. In wet summers, the fungus thrived, unseen until it entered the stomach. Victims suffered both visions and agony. Some danced and raved uncontrollably. Others watched as their fingers and toes turned to lifeless stumps. The suffering seemed otherworldly, and without knowledge of fungi or toxins, people turned to explanations of witchcraft, curses, or divine punishment. The line between the spiritual and the physical blurred in every parish. The Order of St. Anthony became renowned for its care of the afflicted. Founded in France, its monks built hospitals where victims were tended with herbal salves and diets free of contaminated rye. They wore black robes marked with a blue cross, and their houses became sanctuaries for those writhing in torment. Pilgrims flocked to the shrines of St. Anthony, seeking healing through prayer and relics. The church's presence here offered both comfort and structure in the face of chaos. Accounts tell of processions where sufferers cried out to saints, their bodies contorting with spasms as if seized by invisible forces. In towns where outbreaks raged, fear spread quickly. Farmers abandoned rye fields, markets closed, and suspicion fell upon neighbours. Some believed the afflicted to be cursed, others thought them possessed. It is easy to understand why such suffering became entangled with notions of demons and divine wrath, for the signs were as terrifying as any plague. The impact reached beyond bodies into the heart of communities. Families lost breadwinners, villages endured years of hunger after abandoning tainted harvests, and trading grain became a matter of life and death. Merchants carrying rye were met with suspicion, and bakers faced blame for poisoning their neighbours. In this way, food itself, the symbol of life, turned into a source of dread. It was a cruel inversion of trust in the most basic of sustenance. I once passed through a region in the Rhineland where tales of ergotism were still whispered. The fields there bore memories of mothers clutching children seized with visions, of men whose limbs fell away as if consumed by fire. Though the outbreaks had lessened with time, the fear lingered, teaching people to look upon bread with caution. Memory itself became a warning, shaping habits and harvests for generations. Medical understanding was absent, yet observation sharpened survival. Communities began to recognize that certain harvests, darkened with strange kernels, brought greater sickness. Some learned to separate rye carefully. Others sought alternative grains when weather turned damp. These practices lessened the toll, though never banished it. The lessons of experience, written in blood and sorrow, carried more weight than any learned treatise of the time. St. Anthony's fire revealed how fragile the boundary between nourishment and poison could be. It showed that even without war or plague, the daily bread of Europe could betray its people. To live through such times was to learn that danger might lie not in distant lands, but in the loaf shared at one's own table. In that cruel irony, the Middle Ages bore yet another burden, as faith and endurance became the only shields against the fire within. Among the many afflictions that haunted medieval life, smallpox carried a terror both familiar and unrelenting. Unlike sudden plagues that came and went, smallpox lingered, striking repeatedly in towns and courts. Children bore its weight most heavily, with fevers that burned hot and rashes that bloomed across their skin. Those who survived were often left with scars, a lifelong reminder of their brush with death. In households across Europe, parents lived with constant fear, for no prayer could guarantee a child's safety from its reach. The disease did not spare the great. Kings, queens, and nobles succumbed as readily as peasants, and dynasties were reshaped by its hand. In the 13th century, the Norwegian king Håkon IV lost his heir to the sickness, leaving the succession uncertain. Centuries later, other courts across Europe faced similar grief. The throne itself could be undone by the pustules of smallpox, a reminder that power offered no immunity. In this way, politics and illness intertwined more deeply than many care to admit. The devastation was not only in lives lost, but in the rhythm of communities. Outbreaks often coincided with times of war or trade, when movement of armies and merchants brought contagion to new places. Soldiers carried the virus from camp to camp, and caravans spread it across borders. What was traded in silks and spices was accompanied by invisible death. Markets could fall silent, and festivals, once joyful, became gatherings of sorrow. The threads of connection that bound Europe together also carried its undoing. Medieval physicians observed smallpox carefully, though their understanding was bound by the humours of Galen. They noted the fever, the eruption of pustules, and the course of illness, but remedies offered little relief. Honey, herbs, and cooling drinks were given, yet survival depended less on medicine than on the body's own endurance. Some healers claimed that prayers to saints such as Saint Nicaise, protector against childhood diseases, could aid recovery. Faith and medicine were woven tightly together, though both often failed. Those who endured the sickness carried its mark upon their faces. Pitted scars became so common that they shaped the way beauty itself was judged. Survivors bore the memory of the illness not only in their hearts, but upon their skin, a visible sign of life purchased through suffering. In courts and marketplaces, such marks were recognized instantly, reminders of the constant presence of smallpox in daily life. For some, survival meant resilience. For others, it meant a lifetime of hidden shame. Communities turned to ritual as much as to remedies. Processions of prayer were organized, relics displayed, and churches filled with the voices of the desperate. Parents offered votive candles for their children's health, while monks recorded the toll in careful hands. The persistence of smallpox, unlike sudden plagues, gave it a permanence in the rhythm of worship. It became one of the steady shadows against which medieval piety was shaped, carving itself into the relationship between man and God. I recall hearing stories of how entire towns would fall silent when smallpox arrived, as families locked their doors to avoid contagion. Fear of the pustules spread as swiftly as the sickness itself. Yet in the midst of despair, some found strength, tending to their sick with tenderness despite the risk. That willingness to endure suffering for kin became one of the quiet testaments of the age, love persisting where knowledge could not. Smallpox, though less dramatic than the Black Death, was no less decisive in shaping the Middle Ages. It was a steady, grinding presence, eroding life not in one great storm, but in endless waves. By claiming children, nobles, and commoners alike, it became an equalizer in suffering. And though the scars it left may fade from memory, in its time it was one of the most feared companions of human life, a reminder that no era escapes its unseen trials. There was another sickness that claimed lives quietly, without the spectacle of plague pits or the terror of sweating fevers. Measles crept through households, monasteries, and schools, striking children with merciless consistency. Its red rash, fever, and cough were known to every mother and priest, and its presence meant long nights of worry at a child's bedside. Unlike sudden famines or single waves of plague, measles was a companion of medieval life, returning often enough that its cruelty became almost expected. The toll it exacted was measured not only in numbers, but in grief repeated generation after generation. Families could lose one child while another survived, only to see the sickness return years later for the younger ones. Chronicles rarely gave it the dramatic names of other pestilences, yet its silence was deceptive. In the shadows of greater calamities, measles carried away countless lives, especially in crowded towns where the young gathered in close quarters. Its persistence marked entire lineages with sorrow. Schools and religious houses bore particular risk. In the tight dormitories of monasteries, where novices studied and prayed, the disease found fertile ground. Teachers recorded sudden absences, and abbots lamented the loss of promising voices in their choirs. Even the rhythm of learning could be undone by outbreaks, with lessons postponed and communities disrupted. It was not an enemy of nations, as war was, but of every hearth and cloister where children were gathered close. Medieval understanding saw measles as a divine trial. Priests described it as a test placed upon families to strengthen their faith. Parents, left powerless, often turned to saints for intercession, lighting candles in hope of sparing a child. The absence of explanation deepened the sorrow, for without cause, there could be no prevention. To those who endured, the illness felt like an invisible decree, one that chose its victims without reason and without warning. The presence of measles also shaped how childhood itself was understood. Few expected all children to survive into adulthood, and the memory of small coffins was a common part of village life. In towns where the bells rang often, people grew almost accustomed to mourning the young. This acceptance did not lessen the pain, but it did shape the resilience of medieval families, teaching them to live with loss as a constant companion. The fragility of life was never far from view. Trade and travel carried the disease further, just as they did with greater plagues. Merchants moved through fairs, pilgrims walked to shrines, and with them came contagion. A rash that began in a single household could, within weeks, sweep across a region. In this way, measles reminded all that the ties of Europe, those sources of wealth and devotion, also carried risk. The closer the world drew together, the more swiftly death traveled its roads. I once heard a mother in a French village described as weeping that her children had survived famine only to be lost to fever. Such laments were common, showing how measles struck even in times when hunger and war receded. It was not reserved for crisis, but could appear in any season, disrupting even moments of peace. In its unpredictability, it mirrored life itself, fragile and fleeting in ways no sword could rival. Measles left fewer records than the Black Death, yet its shadow was steady and unrelenting. It shaped the rhythm of medieval existence, silently eroding families across centuries. When we remember the Middle Ages, we recall kings, crusades, and famines, but behind them lies the quieter tragedy of childhood death. Measles was one of its most faithful agents, a reminder that even in times untouched by greater calamity, suffering found its way into the heart of every home. At the end of the 15th century, a new and terrible affliction swept across Europe, one that people had never seen before. It emerged around 1494 during the wars in Italy, when French soldiers besieged Naples. Soon after, reports spread of a malady that covered the body with sores, caused unbearable pain, and left its victims disfigured or dead. It came to be called the French pox by some, the Great Pox by others, a mark of both its novelty and its dread. Its arrival added yet another shadow to a continent already weary of plagues. The disease carried not only suffering, but also scandal. Unlike the plague or smallpox, this sickness was linked to the flesh and to sin. Many believed it spread through promiscuity, particularly in the brothels that thrived near military camps. Soldiers returning from war carried it home, and merchants carried it across borders. Shame accompanied its symptoms, for those afflicted were seen not merely as victims of illness, but as bearers of moral corruption. The stigma was as painful as the sores themselves. Contemporaries wrote of its grotesque progression. Skin erupted with ulcers, bones seemed to decay from within, and hair fell away in clumps. In advanced stages, Victims suffered madness and paralysis. Physicians struggled to make sense of it, having no precedent in their texts from Galen or Hippocrates. Treatments included mercury ointments and bloodletting, but these often worsened the condition. The phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," arose from such futile attempts at cure. The French pox spread rapidly through cities, unsettling both rulers and the church. Courts feared its ability to cut down nobles as easily as peasants. Chroniclers noted its presence even among kings and cardinals, a humiliating equalizer that spared no rank. The connection to armies meant its path often mirrored that of conquest, reminding Europe that war brought not only death by sword, but also by unseen contagion. The glory of victory could be followed by the shame of disease. Society responded with both fear and condemnation. Prostitutes were blamed, foreigners accused, and moralists thundered from pulpits about God's judgment on lust. Hospitals for the poxed began to appear in some cities, where sufferers were isolated from the healthy. Yet even in such places, healing was scarce. The afflicted often lived lives of secrecy, hiding their condition until the signs could no longer be concealed. In the silence of their suffering, they bore both physical and spiritual torment. I recall reading accounts of how syphilis reshaped attitudes toward the body and desire. Where once sin had been spoken of in abstract terms, now it was etched visibly into flesh. It became a warning, a living sermon on the dangers of indulgence. For many, the disease seemed to confirm the belief that immorality carried divine punishment. Yet for the afflicted, it was not a lesson, but a lifelong sentence, endured with little hope of relief. Trade ensured that the pox reached far beyond Italy. Within a generation, it was present in France, Spain, England, and the German lands. Pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers carried it into villages that had never heard of Naples. In every corner of Christendom, its signs became familiar, reshaping how people viewed both illness and human intimacy. It was a reminder that the bonds of a connected world carried not only goods and faith, but also new and enduring forms of suffering. The French pox became one of the most enduring diseases of the later Middle Ages, persisting long after its first appearance. Its stigma ensured it was whispered about more than openly described, yet its mark on society was undeniable. By linking disease to morality, it changed how illness itself was understood, casting shadows of shame upon its victims. In this way, it not only ravaged the body, but reshaped the culture of Europe, leaving scars deeper than skin. There was an illness that advanced slowly, quietly, and without the sudden terror of plague, yet it claimed lives without ceasing. Known to us as consumption, it hollowed the body until only skin and bone remained. The cough, the blood upon cloth, and the steady wasting away gave it the name the White Plague. Unlike other afflictions, it did not strike in storms, but lingered like a shadow in every household, stealing fathers, mothers, and children one by one. Its presence was constant, though its approach was patient. The disease thrived in crowded spaces, where air was stale and damp. Monasteries, where men lived in silence and prayer, became breeding grounds for it. In cities, poor families huddled together in single rooms, making transmission inevitable. Even the wealthier quarters were not immune, for the sickness cared little for rank. A noble's bedchamber could echo with the same racking cough as a peasant's hut. No walls were strong enough to keep its breath from entering. Physicians of the Middle Ages struggled to understand consumption. They wrote of corrupted humours and imbalance of heat in the body, prescribing rest, milk, and special diets. Some suggested moving patients to mountain air or drier climates, though such remedies were luxuries only the rich could attempt. For the poor, there was little but hope, prayer, and the slow acceptance of what seemed inevitable. It was a disease that mocked both medicine and devotion. Its cruelty lay not only in death, but in the years it took to arrive. Families watched loved ones grow thinner with each passing season, strength fading as life retreated inch by inch. The slow decline left ample time for sorrow to deepen. The cough became a constant reminder of mortality, each spasm echoing the fragility of the human frame. Children often grew up with the sound as part of their daily lives, shaping their earliest memories with grief. The monastic chronicles are filled with notes of brothers lost to the long, wasting sickness. Infirmaries in abbeys sheltered many who endured it, tended with patience and prayer. Yet even the most compassionate care could not halt its progress. Some monks viewed it as a holy trial, a purifying fire of suffering, while others feared it as a punishment none could escape. The cloisters, once filled with chants, often fell silent as voices weakened and were extinguished. I have seen the scars it left upon survivors as well. Some endured but were never the same, living with weakness in their lungs, unable to labor as before. Whole families sank into poverty because the illness robbed them of their providers. Widows and orphans multiplied in its wake, their lives reshaped by years of watching the slow ebb of a father's breath or a mother's fading voice. Poverty and illness walked hand in hand. Unlike plague or pox, consumption seldom emptied villages in sudden sweeps. Instead, it wore away at society in countless small losses. Its persistence ensured that nearly every family knew it intimately, whether by kin or by neighbor. Generations carried its memory, passing on the tales of loved ones lost not in a single season, but over the course of years. It was a grief stretched long, and perhaps all the heavier for that reason. Tuberculosis, though rarely remembered in the same breath as plague or famine, shaped the Middle Ages with its quiet endurance. It was the unseen hand that pulled at the threads of daily life, unraveling families and weakening communities without spectacle. In its slow devastation, it reminded Europe that not all enemies arrive with sudden fury. Some consume in silence, leaving behind hollowed lives and an emptiness that time alone could not mend. There were moments in our history when suffering took forms stranger than wounds or fever. In towns such as Strasbourg in 1518, people began to dance uncontrollably, moving until their bodies collapsed. At first, it was a handful, then dozens, and soon hundreds filled the streets. They danced not with joy, but with anguish, their limbs jerking as though under an invisible command. Neighbors watched in terror as familiar faces spun toward exhaustion, and some never rose again from the cobblestones. The chronicles describe the fear that swept through these cities. Local authorities believed at first that music might ease the affliction, so they hired musicians and cleared spaces for the dancers. Yet the opposite occurred. The frenzy grew. Men and women danced until their feet bled, their voices gone from cries and gasps. The spectacle defied explanation, and whispers of demonic possession spread quickly. To see so many seized at once was unlike anything Europe had known. Some scholars of my time linked these strange events to divine judgment. They thought the afflicted were being punished for hidden sins, and processions were organized in hopes of appeasing God's anger. Priests led prayers through the streets, yet the dancing continued. Others suggested the work of saints, believing St. Vitus or St. John had cursed the towns. Pilgrimages were ordered to shrines, and offerings laid at altars, but still the convulsions carried on. It seemed no faith could halt it. Modern knowledge suggests another cause, one unknown to us then. The fungus ergot, which poisoned rye and caused hallucinations, may have been at the root of these events. In years of damp harvests, bread itself could have carried madness into the body. Yet to those who lived through it, science had no place, only fear, rumor, and the sight of friends spinning themselves into graves. The memory of that helplessness lingered long after the last dancer fell. The human toll was severe. Some died of exhaustion, others from heart failure or stroke. Families grieved not only the loss of life, but the shame of such deaths, for to dance oneself into ruin seemed an unholy fate. Survivors spoke of visions during their frenzy, sights of angels or demons, flames or floods. Whether born of the body or the spirit, these visions deepened the mystery and sharpened the fear. Communities were left shaken, unsure how to protect themselves. I recall reading of Strasbourg's council, which eventually banned music and closed the spaces where dancers gathered. They attempted to send sufferers to shrines for healing, though few recovered quickly. The event became etched into the town's history, a reminder that not all afflictions arrive with sores or coughs. Sometimes they seize the mind itself, leaving both the victim and the community bewildered. It was a trial that revealed the fragile border between body and spirit. Such outbreaks were not confined to a single town. Records tell of similar events in the Low Countries and the German lands, each time causing panic and confusion. Though smaller than the plagues of death, these epidemics of motion left their mark. They disrupted trade, emptied churches, and forced councils to act with desperate measures. In the imagination of the people, they became signs of a world perpetually under threat from forces beyond comprehension. The dancing plagues remind us that medieval suffering was not always visible in wounds or measured in graves. Sometimes it took the form of madness shared by entire crowds, a contagion of movement that defied reason. For those who lived through it, the sight of neighbours whirling themselves to death was as terrifying as any pestilence. It stands as proof that affliction in those times wore many masks, and each was capable of humbling the human spirit. In my journeys through towns and villages, I learned that sickness was never carried by spirits alone. The true bearers of death often scurried in the shadows, unseen or ignored. Rats thrived in the granaries, their numbers swelling where grain was stored for winter. Fleas lived upon their bodies, drawing blood and passing it between beast and man. Though our age lacked the knowledge to name the chain of transmission, we felt instinctively that vermin heralded ill fortune. Their sudden die-offs were often noted before plague struck. The filth of medieval cities made their presence inevitable. Streets flowed with waste, and animals roamed freely, leaving droppings that nourished swarms of pests. In such conditions, rats multiplied without restraint, feeding on refuse and grain alike. Market squares echoed with the cries of hawkers, while beneath their stalls, shadows moved quietly. The life of commerce and the life of vermin intertwined so closely that one could scarcely be separated from the other. I recall records from chroniclers who noticed curious signs before outbreaks. Dead rats were found in fields and barns, their bodies discarded as nuisances. Yet within weeks, human sickness followed. Though they did not understand why, people learned to dread such discoveries. To them, it seemed the earth itself gave warnings, through the deaths of small creatures, of greater losses to come. The connection was clear in experience, if not in science. Fleas, though invisible in their role, were the silent messengers. Their bites brought more than irritation. They carried the bacillus that wrought devastation. In cramped dwellings, fleas leapt from rats to humans, binding animal and man in a chain of suffering. The poorest bore the greatest burden, sleeping on straw infested with pests, their bodies already weakened by hunger. Yet even noble halls were not immune, for rats crept easily along walls and storerooms, leaving no one untouched. The lack of knowledge shaped responses that often failed. People lit fires of herbs to cleanse the air, believing foul miasmas to be the cause. They prayed, fasted, and fled, but seldom turned their eyes to the swarms in their barns or the scurrying beneath their feet. Had we known the role of vermin, perhaps measures could have been taken sooner. Instead, ignorance left us vulnerable, repeating the same mistakes with each return of pestilence. Still, not all was blindness. In some ports, merchants began to notice that infestations coincided with outbreaks, leading them to attempt primitive forms of control. Cats were prized in certain towns for their skill in hunting rats, and in monasteries, records mention efforts to store grain in ways that reduced spoilage and pests. Such practices, though uneven, show that experience taught what theory could not yet explain. Wisdom came slowly, bought dearly with lives. the imagery of vermin seeped into the culture of the time. Preachers likened sin to rats, multiplying in darkness and spreading corruption. Fleas became symbols in literature, reminders of the small causes that bring vast suffering. People saw in these creatures not only physical danger, but moral lessons, reflecting the medieval habit of drawing meaning from every corner of creation. Even in pestilence, symbolism accompanied survival. The role of rats and fleas, though hidden from full understanding, shaped the fate of Europe more than any battle or treaty. They remind us that the greatest enemies are not always mighty armies, but the smallest of creatures. In their ceaseless movement through fields, barns, and homes, they carried with them the weight of mortality, binding the destiny of men to the humblest of beasts. Such was the silent chain that humbled empires and reshaped the age. When pestilence struck, the first place many turned was not the physician's chamber, but the church. Sickness was seen as punishment, and only repentance could lift it. Bells tolled to summon the faithful, and processions wound through narrow streets with chants rising into the air. Men and women carried relics of saints, holding them high in hope of divine mercy. The sight of whole towns on their knees revealed how deeply fear bound faith, and how illness was believed to be the language of God. Flagellant bands became a common presence during outbreaks. Barebacked, they marched from village to village, striking themselves with whips tipped in iron. They believed that their suffering would atone for the sins of the world and soften God's wrath. Crowds gathered to watch, some moved to tears, others horrified by the spectacle. Yet wherever they travelled, disease often followed, for their gatherings spread contagion as surely as their sermons spread dread. What was meant as penance became another vessel of death. Pilgrimages grew in number during times of pestilence. Families journeyed to shrines thought to hold miraculous power. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Cologne. They sought healing, protection, or absolution for loved ones already gone. Along the roads, sick and healthy mingled, exchanging both prayers and pathogens. In this way, devotion and disease travelled hand in hand, each step toward hope, risking deeper despair. Faith was both a comfort and a carrier. I recall how in some towns, relics were brought from their chapels and paraded through the streets. Bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or garments said to have touched holy figures were held aloft. People crowded close, believing contact with sacred power could shield them. But closeness also meant contagion, and outbreaks often worsened after such ceremonies. The irony was bitter. The very acts meant to save lives hastened more deaths. Priests preached tirelessly that pestilence revealed divine displeasure. Sermons urged fasting, almsgiving, and confession. Some declared that celestial events, eclipses or comets, were signs of God's anger. Others pointed to the corruption of society, the greed of merchants, or the sins of rulers. The explanations varied, but always the message was clear. Humanity's failings had brought calamity upon itself. Faith offered both meaning and blame, shaping how people endured the incomprehensible. These rituals were not only spiritual, but social. In processions, neighbors walked side by side, sharing grief and supplication. Communities found a strange strength in unity, even as they courted greater danger. Singing hymns through the night, they sought to drown out the silence of death that otherwise filled their homes. The collective voice became a shield against despair, reminding all that they did not suffer alone. Even when faith could not cure, it could console. Yet not all trusted these acts. Some saw hypocrisy in the wealth of the church, contrasted with the poverty of the sick. Others grew weary when prayers failed, and the plague returned yet again. Doubt seeped into the heart of Christendom, quiet but persistent, as people wondered whether penance truly reached heaven. In the cracks of such doubt lay the seeds of later reform, planted by centuries of unanswered pleas. The reliance on religious explanation reveals much about the age. Without knowledge of fleas, contagion, or immunity, faith became both the compass and the cure. It brought solace to countless souls, but it also deepened the spread of illness. In that paradox, one sees the tragedy of the Middle Ages, devotion that gave meaning, yet carried death in its shadow. For those who lived then, it was the only language they had to face the terror around them. In the darkest days of pestilence, fear sought a scapegoat. Across Europe, suspicion turned upon Jewish communities, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring against Christendom. These accusations had no foundation, yet desperation made men believe them. Pogroms erupted from the Rhineland to Spain, and entire neighborhoods were destroyed by fire and sword. The cries of the innocent were drowned by the roar of mobs convinced that killing would cleanse disease. In truth, it only deepened the wounds of society, already broken by plague. The persecutions followed a cruel pattern. When pestilence struck, rulers who struggled to calm their people sometimes allowed violence to run unchecked. In Strasbourg in 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, though many had already been baptized or sworn innocence. In Basel, Jewish residents were herded into a wooden house and set aflame. Fear gave way to savagery, and the scapegoat became the sacrifice. Such tragedies repeated wherever suspicion was stoked. Not all leaders condoned this violence. Some popes and kings issued edicts declaring the Jews innocent, urging their protection. Pope Clement VI himself spoke against the charges, reminding Christendom that plague struck everywhere, even where no Jews lived. Yet his words often went unheard, drowned out by the clamour of rage. Local lords, pressed by debt or eager to seize property, found opportunity in the madness, enriching themselves at the cost of human lives. Jewish communities themselves lived under constant dread. In some places, they sought refuge in castles or fled to more tolerant regions, carrying only what they could. Families scattered, traditions disrupted, and centuries-old settlements vanished overnight. Even in towns where violence did not erupt, isolation and suspicion marked daily existence. To be Jewish in plague years was to live with the certainty that any moment could bring the mob to one's door. The accusations revealed more about Christian Europe than about the Jews themselves. They exposed the fragility of unity, the ease with which neighbour turned upon neighbour. When explanations failed, blame became a weapon and prejudice found fertile ground. The plague, invisible and incomprehensible, became the stage upon which old hatreds flared into open slaughter. Innocence mattered little against fear, and reason could not withstand the frenzy of desperation. I recall how chronicles written by monks sometimes recorded these massacres with sorrow, acknowledging the injustice. Yet others wrote of them as divine judgment, justifying the bloodshed. The inconsistency reveals the divided conscience of the age, part capable of pity, part enslaved to prejudice. In these conflicting voices, one can hear the struggle between compassion and fear, a struggle too often lost in the fury of the crowd. For the survivors, exile became the only path. Many moved eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered greater protection. There, Jewish life found new ground, even as the memory of fire and massacre remained alive in song and prayer. The diaspora shifted once again, reshaping the map of Europe's faith communities. From tragedy arose resilience, though born from the ashes of destruction. The persecution of Jews during plagues is a wound still visible in the memory of Europe. It shows how swiftly fear can turn to violence, and how easily suffering seeks a scapegoat. These massacres remind us that disease was not the only killer in the Middle Ages. Hatred itself claimed thousands of lives. In the shadow of pestilence, humanity's frailty was revealed not only in the weakness of the body, but in the cruelty of the heart. In the centuries when pestilence returned again and again, the learned physicians of Europe searched for reasons. Without knowledge of microbes or contagion, they turned to the ancient idea of miasma, foul air rising from decayed matter. It was believed that invisible vapors seeped from swamps, corpses, or rotting waste, corrupting the breath of those who inhaled it. The smell of death and disease seemed to confirm this, for wherever stench was strongest, illness soon followed. In such reasoning, the world itself exhaled sickness. This belief shaped the practices of medicine. Doctors recommended carrying herbs and flowers to sweeten the air, filling chambers with lavender, rosemary, or rosewater. Charcoal fires burned in the streets to cleanse the atmosphere, and perfumes were scattered during processions. In time, physicians adopted the beaked mask, stuffing it with spices and myrrh, convinced the fragrant barrier would purify what entered their lungs. To the people, these figures became symbols of both fear and fragile hope. Miasma theory extended beyond medicine into governance. City councils ordered the cleaning of streets and the burning of waste, not for hygiene as we know it, but to disperse bad air. During outbreaks, markets were moved outside walls, and butchers forced to slaughter further from town centres. In some places, laws restricted night air, for it was thought the chill carried greater corruption. Though misguided in science, these measures sometimes slowed the spread, offering small victories against unseen threats. The church wove these beliefs into ritual. Incense was burned not only as offering, but as protection against pestilence. Priests carried thuribles through streets heavy with smoke, blessing homes with what was believed to be cleansing fragrance. Sacred spaces became perfumed havens, where the faithful sought refuge from the air beyond. Faith and medicine overlapped, each reinforcing the idea that air itself was the battleground of health. Not all agreed on the origins of the foul vapors. Some claimed they rose from earthquakes that released poison from beneath the earth. Others pointed to planetary alignments, believing the heavens themselves stirred the air into corruption. Chroniclers linked pestilence to comets or eclipses, writing that celestial signs heralded the tainted breath of the world. These explanations carried authority, for the cosmos and the earth were thought to speak in harmony, both warning mankind of divine displeasure. I recall writings of the Paris medical faculty in 1348, which declared that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had corrupted the air, giving rise to the Black Death. Their report was copied and circulated across Europe, shaping the understanding of thousands. To the learned, this reasoning seemed unassailable, for it bound together astrology, humours, and miasma in a single explanation. Such words carried weight, even if they brought little relief to the dying. For ordinary people, these theories gave some sense of control. Carrying posies, hanging herbs in doorways, or avoiding marshes became daily acts of protection. Even the phrase, "a bouquet against death," entered common thought, reflecting the hope that pleasant scents could banish corruption. Fear was softened when one could hold a flower or a vial of vinegar in hand, a fragile defense against invisible doom. Such gestures reveal how deeply people longed for any shield, however small. The belief in miasma endured for centuries, guiding responses long into the modern age. Though wrong in its essence, it led to practices of urban cleaning, waste removal, and fresh air that would later prove valuable. In this way, error and progress walked hand in hand. For those of us who lived through it, miasma was not mere theory, but the frame through which all pestilence was understood. It gave shape to fear and ritual to survival, even in ignorance. In the harbours of the Mediterranean, where ships carried both riches and peril, Venice faced the challenge of protecting itself from unseen contagion. By the middle of the 14th century, the city decreed that arriving vessels must wait outside its ports for a set period before entry. At first, it was 30 days, later extended to 40, 40 giorni, from which the word quarantine was born. It was a measure born of necessity, a barrier of time placed between healthy and sick. In that patience lay the seed of public health. The system relied upon strict vigilance. Ships were anchored in lagoons, their crews forbidden to disembark until the days had passed. Goods, too, were held back, for cloth, grain, and spices were all suspected of carrying corruption. Guards patrolled the waters, ensuring no merchant or sailor slipped ashore early. Though imperfect, these practices slowed the tide of pestilence, buying precious time for the city within. Venice became a fortress not only of stone but of regulation. Special hospitals known as lazarettos were built upon islands where those suspected of illness could be confined. The first of these, established in 1423, became a model for others. There, the sick were isolated, cared for by appointed attendants, and kept from mingling with the healthy. Fear was as present as mercy, yet such places reflected a shift. Society no longer relied solely on prayer or procession, but on structured prevention. A new form of vigilance was taking root. Merchants grumbled at the delays, for every lost day meant lost profit. Yet even they came to see the wisdom of the system. A city crippled by plague could not buy or sell, and dead customers were of no use to trade. Thus, commerce itself became bound to the rhythm of quarantine, accepting time as the cost of safety. In this way, the needs of wealth and the needs of survival found uneasy balance. The example spread quickly beyond Venice. Other ports in Italy, and later in France and Spain, adopted similar practices. Even northern cities, connected by rivers and fairs rather than seas, began to enforce isolation for travelers. What began in one lagoon rippled across Europe, shaping responses wherever plague threatened. Though understanding of contagion was absent, experience proved the method effective enough to endure. It was one of the first moments when observation overruled tradition. I remember seeing records of quarrels between towns over the length of quarantine. Some argued for stricter measures, others sought leniency to preserve trade. The debates reveal how survival and prosperity were always in tension. Yet in those arguments lay something new, the recognition that human action could influence the course of pestilence. It was no longer seen solely as divine will, but as something that could in part be managed. That thought alone marked a shift in the medieval mind. The sight of quarantined ships, their sails idle and crews restless, became part of the landscape of plague years. To watch them wait offshore was to see the invisible battle between fear and hope. On the water, time passed heavily. On land, people breathed easier, believing distance could shield them. The sea, once a highway of contagion, became instead a holding ground, where the flow of death was slowed by human decree. Quarantine's invention was a turning point. It did not banish disease, but it demonstrated that society could organize against it with discipline and foresight. In its 40 days lay the seed of modern medicine's principles: isolation, observation, and patience. For a world accustomed to resignation before fate, this was no small thing. It showed that even in the heart of the Middle Ages, amid ignorance and fear, reason could flicker to life, guiding humanity toward endurance. When plague and sickness swept through the land, the sick often turned not to kings or physicians, but to the doors of monasteries and hospitals run by religious orders. These institutions, though humble by our standards, were lifelines in a world without cure. Monks and nuns tended to the afflicted with prayers, herbal remedies, and the comfort of presence. Their work did not banish death, but it softened its cruelty. To be cared for in one's final hours, with a hand to hold and words of scripture spoken, was mercy in itself. Hospitals in the Middle Ages were not merely places of healing, but of shelter. Travelers, the poor, and the diseased often shared the same halls. Infirmaries within monasteries became refuges where care was offered freely, funded by alms and the gifts of patrons. The great hospitallers, who began in Jerusalem to aid pilgrims, spread across Europe, creating a network of charity. Their black robes marked them as servants of both God and the suffering, and their name itself bore the promise of care. The architecture of these hospitals reflected their mission. Large open halls, lined with rows of beds, allowed patients to be under the gaze of priests who prayed constantly. Chapels were built at the center, for healing was thought to come as much through the soul as through the body. Windows were opened for air, herbs burned to cleanse, and water brought from wells blessed for purity. The setting itself became part of the treatment, a blend of devotion and necessity. In times of epidemic, these places filled beyond capacity. Chronicles speak of nuns in Siena or Cologne who collapsed from exhaustion while tending the sick, refusing to abandon their charges even as they fell themselves. The spirit of service became contagious in its own way, inspiring others to offer food, blankets, or burial assistance. Entire orders were shaped by these moments, their identity bound forever to the image of caring amid calamity. Not all such efforts were free from fear. Some hospitals turned away the most visibly afflicted, fearing contagion. Others confined patients to separate wards, marking the beginning of segregation in medical care. Yet even in these choices, one sees the struggle between compassion and survival. Communities could not abandon charity entirely, for to do so was to deny one of the central tenets of Christian life. Balancing safety with mercy became the challenge of every outbreak. The presence of hospitals also brought structure to chaos. They provided records, noting symptoms, recoveries, and deaths. Though the language was steeped in faith, these writings preserved invaluable knowledge of how diseases appeared and spread. Inadvertently, they created the first steps toward a systematic study of illness. What was meant as a ledger of devotion became a resource for the ages, carrying observations that would later guide the birth of medicine. I once visited the ruins of such a hospital in France, its stones weathered, but its memory intact. Villagers still spoke of the brothers who had tended their ancestors, of the fields that had been given to sustain the poor. Even centuries later, gratitude lingered like a fragrance in the air. The legacy of service endured longer than the walls, proving that acts of mercy can outlast even the harshest storms of history. The charitable orders and hospitals of the Middle Ages remind us that even in an age of darkness, compassion lit small flames of hope. They could not cure plague or banish famine, but they offered dignity to those who suffered. In their halls, the sick found rest, the dying found prayer, and the poor found shelter. Such places stand as quiet witnesses that amid fear and death, humanity still chose to serve, to comfort, and to remember. Armies of the Middle Ages often marched not only against rival lords, but also against enemies they could not see. Pestilence stalked the camps, spreading faster than arrows in flight. Dysentery, typhus, and plague turned battlefields into graveyards before swords were drawn. Commanders planned campaigns with care, yet disease unraveled strategies in days. Many chroniclers wrote that more men died in their tents than in combat, leaving battles decided less by valor than by the resilience of the body. During the 100 Years' War, entire campaigns faltered when armies were thinned by sickness. French and English forces alike retreated, not because of defeat in the field, but because too few remained to fight. Supply lines brought food and weapons, but also contagion, carried in carts, animals, and men. Castles fell without a siege, for defenders weakened by illness could not hold their walls. Warfare in that era was always shadowed by the silent question: would disease strike first? Crusades, too, bore this mark. On the long march to the Holy Land, thousands perished of fever, dysentery, and malnutrition before reaching battle. The heat of foreign climates, combined with poor sanitation in camps, turned holy war into mass suffering. Chroniclers of the First Crusade recorded that starvation and disease claimed more lives than swords or Saracen arrows. The memory of these journeys reveals how faith and arms alike were humbled by weakness in the flesh. The Black Death itself changed the course of conflicts. When plague erupted during the siege of Kaffa in 1346, Mongol forces catapulted infected corpses into the city, a grim attempt at biological war. Whether or not this act spread plague into Europe, it demonstrated how sickness could be weaponized, altering the very rules of conflict. Fear of contagion became as potent as the threat of steel, reshaping how towns and armies defended themselves. Even in smaller wars, disease dictated outcomes. Local feuds often ended when both sides lost men to illness, forcing truces or surrenders. Knights trained in arms were undone by polluted water, and mercenaries, who sold their strength to the highest bidder, sometimes fell before they could earn their pay. The value of courage diminished when camp fever struck, for no shield or armor could deflect its advance. In this, war revealed its futility, undone by the smallest of foes. I have heard soldiers speak of the dread that filled camps when sickness first appeared. The smell of waste, the buzzing of flies, and the groans of the fevered spread faster than courage. Men deserted, not for fear of battle, but for fear of rotting alive in straw beds. The order of armies collapsed when disease weakened discipline, showing that even the most hardened warriors were as fragile as children before the hand of illness. These afflictions also reshaped military medicine. Commanders appointed surgeons to tend their men, and rudimentary practices of sanitation began to emerge. Some armies dug latrines away from camps, others enforced the boiling of water. Though crude, such measures were the first steps toward recognizing the role of environment in survival. Out of war's suffering, fragments of practical knowledge began to form, offering glimmers of progress amid devastation. The presence of disease in warfare teaches that victory and defeat were never decided by weapons alone. Behind the banners and trumpets lay the silent hand of contagion, ready to fell the mighty and humble the proud. Medieval wars remind us that history's course was shaped as much by fever as by sword, and that armies are but fragile gatherings of flesh, undone as easily by the weakness within as by the enemy without. When armies laid siege to a city, hunger and disease often proved sharper than swords. Soldiers camped outside the walls endured filth, spoiled food, and stagnant water, while those trapped within starved in confinement. Both sides watched as sickness spread, thinning ranks without a single blow exchanged. In 1346, during the siege of Kaffa on the Black Sea, the Mongols struck terror into the defenders by hurling plague-ridden corpses over the walls. Whether symbolic or effective, it revealed how disease itself could be turned into a weapon. The use of contagion was not unique to that moment. Accounts from medieval chronicles tell of wells poisoned with carcasses or excrement, intended to break a city's resistance. Water, the lifeblood of any garrison, became a channel of death when corruption was cast into its source. For defenders, each drink carried fear. To endure a siege was to weigh thirst against sickness, a torment that eroded both strength and morale. Disease became a weapon wielded without blade or bow. The horror of such tactics lay not only in their cruelty, but in their unpredictability. Once released, contagion cared little for friend or foe. Besiegers often fell victim to their own designs, for wind and water carried sickness back upon them. Armies that sought to weaken their enemies sometimes found themselves collapsing under the same invisible hand. The gamble of biological assault revealed the desperation of war, where victory justified even self-destruction. Cities, too, bore scars from these assaults. After a siege broken by pestilence, survivors often returned to ruined homes filled with death. Walls might still stand, but the lifeblood of the town, its people, was gone. The memory of poisoned wells lingered long after, shaping distrust of outsiders and deepening the fear of contamination. The legacy of such tactics was not only military, but social, eroding the bonds between neighboring regions. For those who lived through it, the blending of war and disease blurred the lines of fate. Was pestilence a weapon of man or a punishment from God? Chroniclers debated, some condemning the cruelty of armies, others insisting that such horrors were divine judgment upon sinners. Faith and strategy intertwined, leaving future generations uncertain where human choice ended and heaven's decree began. The records show how war and belief together forged a darker memory of plague. I remember reading of soldiers who feared disease more than arrows. To die from a fever in a trench, without glory or recognition, seemed a fate worse than being struck in combat. Morale crumbled when coughs and fevers spread, and commanders struggled to keep order. In such conditions, the resolve of armies faltered before the city walls themselves had been breached. Death in the camp often decided outcomes before gates were ever forced open. These tactics also shaped later rules of conduct. Though no formal laws forbade the use of contagion in war during the Middle Ages, the memory of its devastation left unease. Generals knew the peril of unleashing forces they could not control. In time, the horror of these practices became a warning that to weaponize disease was to risk the destruction of both victor and vanquished alike. War itself revealed the folly of tampering with death. The story of siege warfare and contagion stands as a grim testament to desperation. It shows that men, pressed to extremes, would turn even to the corruption of flesh as a weapon. Yet it also reminds us that in every such act, the price was shared by all, for disease answered to no master. In those dark moments, humanity glimpsed the truth that war and pestilence together were forces beyond its command, humbling even the mightiest of armies. The towns of medieval Europe were places of bustle and trade, yet beneath their liveliness lay filth that bred disease. Streets were narrow and unpaved, often little more than channels for refuse and rain. Waste from households, butchers and tanners was cast into alleys, where it mixed with the droppings of animals kept within the walls. The air carried the stench of dung and decay, a constant reminder of how close life stood to corruption. In such conditions, pestilence found its most welcoming home. Water, too, bore danger. Wells were dug within towns, yet often stood close to cesspits or drains. Contamination was common, and outbreaks of dysentery and cholera-like illnesses swept through communities. Rivers that gave life also carried death, for towns emptied their waste into the same streams from which they drew their drinking water. To survive in such a place was to risk sickness with every swallow, a daily gamble taken without knowledge of its cause. Authorities attempted to impose order, yet their efforts were piecemeal. In London, ordinances forbade the dumping of refuse in the Thames, though the law was often ignored. In Paris, rakers were appointed to clear the streets, but their work was quickly undone by the endless tide of filth. Markets were regulated to keep slaughterhouses outside the busiest quarters, yet blood and offal still found their way underfoot. Regulation and reality seldom met in harmony. Animals shared the streets with people. Hogs, chickens and dogs roamed freely, feeding on scraps and spreading further mess. Horses filled the thoroughfares, leaving behind their constant leavings. The sound of carts clattering over cobblestones was matched by the buzz of flies rising from heaps of dung. To walk through a medieval town was to tread amid life and waste together, with little separation between what nourished and what sickened. I have seen how famine worsened this burden. In lean years, people searched heaps of refuse for scraps, consuming what was spoiled and tainted. Hunger drove men to eat food unfit for beasts, and illness followed. In times of plenty, filth accumulated from abundance. In times of scarcity, it became a desperate larder. Thus, whether fortune smiled or frowned, the presence of waste shaped the health of the people, its shadow inescapable. Plague spread swiftly in such environments. Fleas thrived in the hay of stables and the rags of beggars, while rats multiplied in granaries and gutters. When pestilence arrived, the crowded quarters of towns became tinder for the fire. The wealthy sometimes fled to country estates, leaving the poor behind to endure the brunt of contagion. Yet even nobles could not escape entirely, for their servants carried the memory of the city with them. Disease recognized no rank. There were moments of progress, small though they seemed. Some towns built conduits to bring cleaner water from springs beyond their walls. Public baths, though few, offered places of washing that eased filth from skin. Guilds established rules for cleanliness in crafts like baking and brewing, fearing that contamination would drive customers away. These efforts show that even without full understanding, people sought to carve order from squalor. Their struggle was constant, yet not without effect. The memory of medieval towns reminds us that sickness was as much a product of place as of chance. Urban filth was not an accident, but the result of growth unprepared for its own weight. Crowded lives, narrow lanes, and absent sewers turned prosperity into peril. In such a world, disease was not merely an invader, but a resident, dwelling in every street and square. To endure it was to live amid both vitality and decay side by side. Illness did not respect borders, and the highways of commerce became its chosen paths. From the bustling markets of the East to the ports of Italy, caravans and ships carried not only goods but contagion. The Silk Road linked Asia to Europe, a marvel of exchange, yet along with silk and spices came unseen death. The Black Death itself likely travelled this way, borne by traders who never knew what rode with them. Trade bound continents together in wealth, but it also wove a web for pestilence. Ports were especially vulnerable. In Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, ships unloaded treasures from afar, but also rats and fleas that spread sickness into crowded harbours. Dock workers and merchants were among the first to fall, their contact with goods and sailors sealing their fate. From these ports, disease radiated inland along riverways and roads, tracing the very arteries of commerce. What enriched cities in times of peace also imperiled them in times of plague. Markets and fairs, too, became points of danger. Great gatherings such as the Champagne fairs in France drew merchants from across Europe. They came to buy, sell, and bargain, yet their presence created fertile ground for contagion. A single infected traveller could ignite an outbreak that spread from stall to stall, town to town. What began as commerce ended as mourning, leaving entire regions weakened. Prosperity and peril arrived in the same wagons. Pilgrimage routes carried sickness as faithfully as they carried devotion. Pilgrims walked the roads to Santiago, Rome, and Canterbury, mingling with strangers in hostels and chapels. Along the way, coughs and fevers spread without notice, carried from shrine to shrine. In their search for healing and forgiveness, the faithful unknowingly bore illness into new lands. Sacred journeys became unwitting channels for suffering, blending faith and fragility into a single road. The northern trade of the Hanseatic League was no less exposed. Ships sailed between Lubeck, Hamburg, and London, their holds filled with grain, cloth, and timber. Yet rats stowed away in the cargo, leaping from ship to shore at every stop. Outbreaks often followed these routes, showing how deeply Europe's prosperity was entwined with its vulnerability. To trade was to risk, and the balance between gain and loss was measured in both coin and life. I have read of caravans that crossed from the Black Sea into the heart of Europe, carrying silks, jewels, and invisible ruin. The path of disease could be traced by the timing of deaths in successive towns. Merchants themselves sometimes perished midway, their wagons abandoned on lonely roads, left as mute testimony to the danger of movement. The very roads that knit Europe together became lines of sorrow, binding distant places in shared grief. The speed of transmission astonished chroniclers. A pestilence could move hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, leaping from port to inland village with relentless pace. Rumours often arrived only a few days before the sickness itself. In this way, anticipation brought as much dread as the disease, for people knew death was approaching yet could not flee fast enough. Trade routes became threads of inevitability, tightening around Europe with every passing day. The history of plague shows that Europe's interconnectedness was both its strength and its weakness. Commerce brought wealth, variety, and cultural exchange, but it also laid open the arteries through which disease coursed. The more Europe grew connected, the more vulnerable it became. The story of these routes is a reminder that progress carries shadow as well as light, and that the very bridges we build for prosperity can also bear the weight of sorrow. Much of what we know about the great afflictions of the Middle Ages comes from the pens of monks. In the quiet of their cloisters, they recorded the toll of pestilence with sober precision. Chronicles noted the years, the symptoms, and the numbers who perished, providing us with glimpses into the rhythm of suffering. Their words, though framed by faith, offer some of the clearest testimonies of how disease moved through the land. Without their diligence, much of this history would have faded into silence. These writings reveal more than numbers. They speak of the collapse of villages, the weeping of widows, and the despair of priests who buried dozens in a single day. Chroniclers often wrote with trembling hands, for they themselves were not spared. Some entries break off abruptly, unfinished by the scribe who succumbed before completing his work. In these interruptions, we hear the voice of death itself, silencing memory as it was being written. Scholars outside the monasteries also contributed to this fragile record. Physicians in universities, such as Paris and Bologna, attempted to describe causes and cures. Their treatises blended observation with classical learning, weaving Aristotle and Galen into explanations of pestilence. While their remedies were often ineffective, their attention to detail left us invaluable accounts of symptoms and spread. These works bridged the gap between devotion and science, offering a foundation for the knowledge to come. I recall reading how monks in England counted the toll of the Black Death with chilling simplicity. So many died that no one was left to bury the dead. Others in Italy described entire towns abandoned, their silence broken only by the tolling of church bells. Such words are stark, yet they carry the weight of lived experience. They remind us that behind every statistic lay countless personal tragedies, witnessed and preserved in ink. These records also reflect the mindset of the age. Writers often interpreted pestilence as punishment, weaving moral lessons into their accounts. They linked outbreaks to eclipses, earthquakes, or human sin, believing that the world itself groaned in anger. Yet amid such interpretations, they also described the tangible, the swelling of buboes, the sudden fevers, the corpses lying unburied. In their struggle to make sense of calamity, they left us both theology and observation side by side. Not all records survived. Libraries fell to fire, war, or neglect, and countless manuscripts were lost. Yet enough remains to paint a picture of how medieval society endured wave after wave of affliction. Each monastery, each scriptorium, added a thread to the tapestry, preserving memory against the erasure of time. The survival of these documents is itself a testament to the endurance of the written word in the face of destruction. The voices of chroniclers also shaped later generations. Their accounts influenced how people remembered the past, turning memory into warning. Tales of pestilence guided responses in later centuries, shaping laws of quarantine, prayers of intercession, and even works of art. The act of writing became more than record-keeping. It became part of Europe's collective survival, a way to carry experience forward to those who had not lived it. The records left by monks and scholars are fragile windows into that age of suffering. Through them, we see not only the scope of loss, but the resilience of memory. They carried grief, faith, and observation across centuries, so that even now we may learn from them. In their lines of ink lies the determination of men who, even as death surrounded them, chose to remember, to preserve, and to speak for the silent multitudes lost to time. The repeated blows of pestilence did not only empty graves, they unsettled the very order of society. Feudal bonds, once thought unshakable, began to fray when entire villages vanished and lords found their fields untended. Labor became scarce, and those who survived discovered their worth. Serfs who once bent under obligation now demanded wages or freedom, knowing that their toil could no longer be taken for granted. In this shift lay the first cracks in the feudal structure that had bound Europe for centuries. The shortage of workers forced landowners into desperate bargains. Fields went untilled, rents went unpaid, and lords competed to keep peasants from fleeing to freer lands. Some offered better terms, reducing obligations and allowing greater independence. Others clung to old demands, sparking resentment and revolt. The balance of power tilted slowly, yet unmistakably, toward those who held the plough rather than the sword. Disease had given the lowly a voice that no decree could silence. One of the clearest signs of this change came in England with the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Though taxes sparked the uprising, the deeper cause lay in demographic collapse from the plague. Survivors refused to return to bondage, and their anger erupted in violence against manorial lords and royal officials. The revolt was crushed, yet the spirit behind it endured, showing that the old order could be challenged. Pestilence had altered not only bodies, but the imagination of society. In towns, guilds also gained strength. With fewer craftsmen alive, apprentices rose faster through the ranks, and wages increased. The scarcity of skilled labor allowed artisans to demand rights once unthinkable, reshaping urban life. New wealth began to concentrate in the hands of merchants and guildsmen, undermining the supremacy of landed nobility. The fabric of society was rewoven, not by decree, but by the slow and relentless arithmetic of death and survival. The church, too, felt the strain of this transformation. With fewer peasants bound to the land, tithes dwindled, and clerical authority weakened. In some places, monasteries lost entire estates as tenants disappeared. The old alliance between altar and manor was no longer secure. Faith endured, but its worldly foundation trembled, eroded by the same shortages that reshaped every other corner of society. Even devotion could not halt the shifting balance of power. I remember reading how some lords, desperate to hold their tenants, granted charters of freedom or reduced feudal dues. What had once been privileges became bargaining chips for survival. These concessions, made piecemeal, accumulated into broader change. Over time, serfdom withered in much of Western Europe, though it lingered longer in the East. The rhythm of village life, once anchored by obligation, grew looser, more mobile, and more open to negotiation. The decline of feudalism was not immediate, nor was it uniform. Yet the repeated scythe of pestilence ensured that every generation faced the same imbalance: too few hands for too much land. Each outbreak pressed the old system further toward collapse, until its authority seemed hollow. What warfare and politics could not achieve, disease accomplished silently, reshaping the destiny of Europe without sword or crown. The manor lost its grip, and new powers rose in its place. The memory of these changes reminds us that catastrophe can also create transformation. The feudal bonds of duty and service, once thought eternal, unraveled beneath the weight of empty villages and abandoned fields. From the suffering of countless lives emerged a new social order, one that allowed greater freedom, mobility, and voice for the common man. Thus, even as pestilence brought sorrow, it also carved new paths, reshaping the very structure of medieval society. In the years when pestilence thinned the living, artists found new ways to speak of death's dominion. One of the most haunting expressions was the danse macabre, the dance of death. Painted on church walls and carved in stone, it showed skeletons leading kings, priests, and peasants hand in hand. No rank was spared, no station immune. The message was simple, yet profound. Death claimed all equally, and in its company, every earthly title was stripped away. These images spread widely in the 15th century, when recurring waves of plague kept mortality ever present. In Basel, Lübeck, and Paris, entire murals depicted long lines of the living drawn into death's embrace. The figures were often shown mid-step, half alive, half skeletal, as though caught between two worlds. To the faithful who gazed upon them, the art was both warning and consolation. Warning of life's brevity, consolation that none suffered alone in their fate. Plays and poems joined the paintings, bringing the dance of death to life in words and performance. Travelling actors staged scenes where death mocked kings and jested with merchants, reminding audiences that wealth and power offered no shield. These performances, half grim and half satirical, became part of civic life, shaping how entire communities reflected on their mortality. In the echo of laughter mixed with fear, truth struck deeper than sermons could. The Black Death had carved these images into memory. But the tradition endured even when pestilence subsided. Death's dance became a cultural companion, shaping how people understood fortune and fate. Unlike earlier medieval art that emphasized heavenly glory, these works brought the grave into sharp focus. They asked viewers to reckon not with paradise first, but with the certainty of decay. Such art was a mirror held before all, showing what waited at the end of every road. I have stood before fragments of those murals, faded yet powerful. Even as centuries wore away their colors, the figures seemed to move still, their skeletal hands beckoning. Villagers once prayed beneath those walls, their eyes lifted from the altar to the dance, reminded that faith was their only shield against time. The stones themselves became sermons, preaching without voice the equality of all in the face of death. The danse macabre also influenced music. Hymns and chants incorporated the theme of death's universality, weaving somber tones into worship. Bells tolled with greater weight, their echoes carrying the rhythm of mortality through the air. In sound, as in image, the dance became part of daily life, ensuring that no one could escape its reminder. It was less an art form than a presence, a constant companion in the medieval imagination. Such creations did not arise from despair alone. They also reflected resilience, the will to transform grief into expression. By giving death a shape, whether skeletal or mocking, people could confront it more directly. To depict the grave was to rob it of some of its terror, to make it familiar, if not friendly. The art became a way of living with fear, shaping it into something that could be seen, spoken, and even laughed at. The dance of death remains one of the most enduring legacies of plague years. It reveals not only how mortality haunted medieval minds, but also how creativity offered solace. By placing kings and peasants in the same line, it affirmed the shared humanity of suffering. The murals, songs, and plays were not mere ornament, but reflections of a world where death was always near, yet where memory and art kept the living bound together. When pestilence descended, the first blow was to human life, but the second was to the economy that sustained it. Fields lay untended as peasants died or fled, livestock perished for lack of care, and harvests rotted in place. Trade faltered, markets emptied, and coin lost its value when no goods could be purchased. Craftsmen's shops closed as apprentices succumbed, leaving skills unpassed. The wealth of kingdoms shrank, not through theft or conquest, but through the silent erosion of labor and exchange. The collapse was felt most sharply in agriculture. Grain prices soared when harvests failed, only to collapse again when fields were abandoned and surpluses spoiled. Landowners who once grew rich from rents now watched as their tenants vanished. Vast estates fell into ruin, their halls quiet and their fields overtaken by weeds. The old rhythm of planting and gathering faltered, and with it, the steady heartbeat of medieval life. Poverty deepened even for those who survived, for food itself became uncertain. Yet from ruin came shifts that none had foreseen. With labor scarce, wages rose for those who remained. Artisans demanded more for their craft, peasants for their toil, and servants for their service. Lords who resisted faced rebellion or flight, while others conceded, reshaping the balance of power. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, opened where gaps had been left by the dead. The very structure of wealth bent under the pressure of absence, granting opportunities amid despair. Commerce adapted slowly but surely. Merchants who survived inherited the goods and connections of their rivals, building fortunes from the void. Trade routes reopened as demand for luxury goods revived among those enriched by inheritance. Cities scarred by death gradually filled again with buyers and sellers. Markets once deserted began to hum once more, though always with the memory of silence lingering in the background. Recovery came in uneven steps, but it came nonetheless. I recall how chroniclers noted the strange paradox of these times. Death brought both misery and wealth. Survivors inherited lands, shops, and titles from relatives who had perished. Widows gained new independence, orphans sometimes rose to unexpected prominence, and whole families shifted upward in status. The sorrow of loss mingled with sudden prosperity, creating a world where grief and opportunity walked side by side. It was a transformation paid for in lives, yet it altered the destiny of generations. Guilds and towns took advantage of the moment to strengthen their place. Regulations were rewritten, privileges expanded, and charters renewed with greater freedom. The weakening of feudal lords allowed urban centres to flourish, turning merchants into powers that rivaled nobility. Cities became engines of renewal, their walls not only defending but also shaping new ways of life. Out of devastation, a different Europe began to take form, more urban, more commercial, and more dynamic. Even the arts felt the touch of recovery. Patrons enriched by inheritance began to commission works, filling churches with frescoes and altarpieces. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, yet it was used to rebuild what had been lost. In this way, memory of plague was transformed into stone and paint, shaping the culture that followed. What had been lament became legacy, carried forward in beauty, even as scars remained. The economic collapse of plague years was profound, but the recovery revealed resilience. Europe did not remain in silence. It adapted, reshaped, and grew in new directions. The rhythms of labor, wealth, and trade changed forever, breaking old patterns and forging new ones. In this balance of loss and renewal, the Middle Ages revealed both its fragility and its endurance, proving that even in the face of devastation, life found a way to begin again. When plague returned again and again, the prayers of the faithful seemed to rise unanswered. People filled churches, confessed sins, and walked in barefoot processions, yet the pestilence did not relent. This failure to bring relief shook confidence in the very institution that had long been the heart of Europe. The Church, once seen as the unshakable pillar of divine protection, faced murmurs of doubt. Faith endured, but trust in clerical authority began to crack beneath the weight of repeated calamity. Priests themselves suffered heavily. Many died while tending to the sick, leaving parishes without guidance or sacraments. Others fled, abandoning their flocks in fear, and their absence left bitterness behind. In towns where confession could no longer be given, people turned to unlicensed preachers or formed their own practices of devotion. The vacuum of leadership became fertile ground for alternative voices, questioning whether the Church's power was as absolute as it claimed. The corruption within the hierarchy deepened the crisis. Indulgences were sold with greater fervor, promising protection from pestilence in exchange for coin. Relics multiplied, many of doubtful origin, paraded as shields against disease. For those who saw these acts fail, suspicion grew that the institution valued wealth more than salvation. What might once have been tolerated as custom now appeared hollow, exposed by the silence of heaven amid unrelenting death. I remember accounts of flagellant groups wandering from town to town, striking themselves bloody in acts of penance. They defied the Church's control, declaring that only personal sacrifice could appease God's anger. Their popularity revealed the hunger for spiritual answers outside clerical structures. Though eventually suppressed, their movement showed that authority was not absolute, and that ordinary people were willing to seek salvation beyond the walls of cathedrals. Monastic orders, once revered for their devotion, also declined in reputation. With so many brothers and sisters lost, many houses fell into disrepair, their libraries abandoned, and their fields empty. Survivors sometimes grew lax, unable to maintain the strict observances of their rule. Critics pointed to this decay as proof that the Church no longer embodied the discipline it preached. The image of stability was eroded from within as well as without. At the same time, new currents of thought began to emerge. Scholars at universities, reflecting on the failure of prayer to halt plague, turned their attention more toward natural causes. Though still framed by theology, their writings planted seeds of a more questioning spirit. Slowly, the monopoly of religious explanation weakened, replaced by the first stirrings of inquiry that would blossom in centuries to come. Pestilence forced open the door to doubt, and once opened, it could not be closed. For the common people, the crisis of faith was deeply personal. To bury child after child, despite fervent devotion, left many with questions they dared not voice. Some clung more tightly to ritual, while others drifted into quiet skepticism. The silence of God in those years was a heavy burden, borne differently in every heart. Out of that silence came both despair and resilience, shaping how Europe would later reform its spiritual life. The plagues did not destroy religion, but they transformed it. They revealed the limits of clerical power and opened space for voices that challenged the old order. When the Reformation finally arrived, it did so on soil long prepared by centuries of disillusionment. In this sense, pestilence was as much a force of spiritual change as of death, reshaping not only the body of Europe but the soul of Christendom itself. Late in the 16th century, Milan became the stage for one of the last great epidemics of the age. The years 1576 and 1577 brought a wave of plague that cut deep into the heart of the city. It came silently, borne along trade and movement, until the death toll could no longer be ignored. Entire districts emptied, and silence fell upon streets that had once echoed with merchants' cries. The city that had thrived as a centre of commerce and culture now wore the mask of desolation. The civic response revealed both fear and determination. Authorities ordered strict quarantines, closing gates and confining the sick to their homes. Guards patrolled streets, ensuring no one broke the laws of isolation. Lazarettos, plague hospitals built outside the city, filled with the afflicted. These measures were harsh, but Milan sought to contain the sickness with a discipline that had rarely been seen before. In the struggle, the foundations of organized public health were laid. Carlo Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan, became a figure of note during these trials. He chose to remain in the city when others fled, tending to the sick and leading processions of prayer. His presence brought comfort to many, even as critics argued that gatherings risked spreading the disease further. Borromeo's acts of devotion left a lasting mark, and he was later remembered as a saintly example of courage. Faith and fear walked side by side in those days. The lazarettos themselves were grim places. Thousands were confined in their walls, tended by physicians and attendants who often perished alongside their patients. Food was delivered through guarded channels, and the dead were carried away in carts to hastily dug pits. Records describe the cries and laments that filled these institutions, where survival was rare and despair constant. Yet their very existence reflected a shift. Society was beginning to build structures devoted solely to combating contagion. Economically, the plague struck at Milan's wealth. Trade with other Italian cities dwindled, and artisans saw their workshops abandoned. Grain shipments slowed, and famine threatened to join pestilence in the city's suffering. The scars of this collapse endured long after the epidemic waned, reshaping patterns of commerce and labor. Survivors inherited, but prosperity was uneven, and many crafts were lost entirely. The cost was measured in both coin and lives. The memory of this outbreak spread beyond Milan. Other Italian cities studied its response, adapting quarantine and lazaretto systems of their own. Chronicles and medical treatises written during these years were copied and circulated, forming a body of knowledge that would inform later centuries. The epidemic became not only a tragedy, but also a lesson, showing that observation and structure could temper the reach of pestilence, if not entirely defeat it. I recall reading how the people of Milan filled the streets with hymns when the epidemic finally ebbed in 1577. Bells tolled in thanksgiving, and churches reopened with renewed fervour. Survivors carried both grief and gratitude, their memories sharpened by the knowledge of how close the city had come to ruin. The return of life was celebrated all the more for having brushed so near to extinction. Relief and remembrance blended in every voice raised to heaven. The Plague of Milan stands as one of the last great outbreaks before Europe began to edge slowly toward the modern age. It revealed the endurance of faith, the growing strength of civic order, and the unbroken thread of sorrow that ran through the centuries of disease. In its shadows, Milan carved out new ways to resist contagion, leaving a legacy of vigilance and resilience that still echoes in the history of medicine and devotion alike. Among the enemies that stalked medieval armies, none was so relentless as typhus, the fever of camps. Spread by lice in filthy clothing and bedding, it thrived wherever soldiers or refugees gathered in close quarters. Its signs were unmistakable: high fever, rash, delirium, and death within days. Unlike the plague, it did not require rats or fleas, only human suffering and neglect. War and famine together made the perfect soil for its spread, turning hunger and battlefields into breeding grounds of despair. During sieges, when defenders and attackers alike were confined in unsanitary conditions, typhus often appeared. Chroniclers tell of armies wasting away before walls, too weak to raise their weapons. In some campaigns, more men died of the fever than of enemy blades. To fight hunger was hard enough. To fight hunger and fever together was ruinous. Castles fell, not through force of arms, but through the invisible hand of disease that leveled all resolve. Famines worsened the toll. When crops failed and people roamed the countryside in search of food, typhus traveled with them. Starving bodies offered little resistance, and lice multiplied in rags that could not be changed. Whole villages perished not from lack of bread alone, but from the fever that followed their weakness. Hunger invited pestilence, and pestilence deepened hunger, creating a cycle that no prayer nor sword could break. Armies feared typhus as much as battle. During the Crusades and later conflicts, commanders lamented the collapse of their forces to camp fever. It became clear that an army's greatest threat was not always its opponent, but its own encampment. Marches slowed, morale crumbled, and campaigns were abandoned. Victory became hollow when soldiers perished in their tents, leaving fields littered not with the slain of combat, but with the fevered dead of neglect. The poor bore its weight most heavily. Lacking clean clothing or space to separate the sick, families passed the fever from bed to bed. In towns, beggars huddled together in alleys, carrying lice that spread the disease further. The wealthy fled, but even they were not immune, for servants brought the contagion into their households. Typhus respected no rank, yet it always found its first victims among those who had the least. I remember reading of outbreaks where confusion reigned, for the signs of typhus were often mistaken for plague. Physicians argued, unsure whether foul air or divine wrath was at work. Remedies proved futile, and patients slipped into delirium, speaking nonsense before death silenced them. To watch such decline was to see reason itself crumble, as fever stripped away memory and sense. Families could only look on, powerless, as loved ones vanished into shadows of the mind. Despite its devastation, typhus rarely inspired the art or sermons that plague did. Its spread was too constant, too entwined with ordinary hardship, to become a symbol. Yet in its quiet way, it shaped the fate of wars, harvests, and kingdoms. Victories were lost, treaties delayed, and regions emptied of people because of its steady toll. Where plague came in waves, typhus lingered, a dull ache that never fully disappeared from Europe's story. Typhus reveals how deeply disease was bound to the rhythms of war and want. It was not the terror of sudden pestilence, but the slow grinding fever that hollowed armies and villages alike. Its presence shows that death did not always strike with spectacle. Sometimes it crept through lice and rags, unnoticed until it was too late. In famine and in siege, it reminded mankind that survival hinged not only on courage or fortune, but on the unseen frailties of the body. When I reflect on the centuries of pestilence, I see that their legacy was more than death. It was transformation. The Middle Ages were reshaped at every level by disease, from the collapse of villages to the redrawing of kingdoms. Populations dwindled, Yet in their absence, survivors found new freedoms. Fields lay abandoned, but new opportunities arose for those who tilled them. Out of devastation came change, slow and uneven, yet unmistakable in its reach. The memory of plague altered how communities organized themselves. Towns built lazarettos, enforced quarantines, and appointed officials to oversee cleanliness. Though crude, these efforts marked the beginnings of public health. No longer was sickness accepted only as divine punishment. It was confronted with human rules and discipline. This legacy endured, laying a foundation for later generations to build upon. Proof that suffering could also yield wisdom. Art and culture bore the marks as well. The Danse Macabre, with its skeletal procession, reminded all of death's equality. Literature and sermons echoed with themes of fragility and repentance. Music deepened in tone, reflecting grief and the search for hope. Even the architecture of churches shifted, with more emphasis on memorials and chapels of remembrance. The cultural imprint of disease shaped the soul of Europe as surely as it shaped its flesh. Religion, once unquestioned, faced new scrutiny. The failure of prayers to halt plague led many to doubt clerical authority. Reform movements gained strength, planted in soil watered by centuries of disappointment. Though faith endured, it no longer held the same unshakable dominance. In its place grew a more restless spirit, seeking answers beyond the pulpit, paving the way for later upheavals in Christendom. Pestilence had weakened the strongest of walls, the authority of the church itself. Economy and society also changed irrevocably. Labour shortages gave peasants bargaining power, fueling revolts and slowly dissolving the chains of serfdom. Wealth shifted through inheritance, creating new classes of merchants and landowners. Towns grew in influence as feudal lords lost their grip. These shifts, born of death, carried Europe toward modernity, a reminder that even ruin can be a doorway to renewal. The world after plague was not the same as before. The sciences, too, felt the weight of these years. Though explanations of miasma and astrology dominated, observation grew sharper. Monks and physicians recorded symptoms with care, building a body of knowledge that would later guide medicine. The spark of inquiry flickered brighter because of the darkness, showing that even in error, progress was possible. Pestilence, unwillingly, became a teacher, forcing men to look closer at the world around them. I have seen how the memory of these epidemics endured in families, passed down in stories of survival and loss. Songs, proverbs, and folk practices all carried echoes of plague years. They became part of Europe's collective memory, a quiet reminder of resilience amid sorrow. Even when centuries passed, the lessons lingered, shaping how people faced famine, war, and later sicknesses. The past remained a guide, though written in suffering. The legacy of medieval epidemics is therefore twofold: devastation and renewal. They stripped away lives, yet also stripped away illusions, leaving societies to rebuild upon new ground. The scars remained, etched into culture, faith, and governance, but so too did a deeper endurance. In the long shadow of plague, Europe learned not only its fragility, but also its capacity to adapt, and in that balance of sorrow and strength, a new world slowly emerged. Though centuries have passed since the bells tolled for plague victims, the echoes of those times still reach us. Modern pandemics, whether the influenza of 1918 or the recent scourge of COVID-19, remind us that fear, isolation, and loss are not strangers to humanity. The Middle Ages taught us that disease reshapes not only bodies but societies, forcing people to question authority, to change habits, and to find meaning in suffering. What we endure today is not new, but another verse in a long, somber song. The quarantine first devised in Venice became the blueprint for modern isolation measures. Ships once held offshore now find their mirror in airports and closed borders. The 40 days of waiting, born in desperation, live on in lockdowns and restrictions. We still rely on time and distance to weaken the grip of contagion, proving that even in our age of science, the medieval world whispers its lessons into our ear. Fear and patience remain familiar companions. The stigma borne by lepers finds its echo in the ostracism of those infected in later centuries. The tendency to blame, to exclude, or to seek scapegoats still emerges in times of panic. Medieval Jews were falsely accused of poisoning wells. In modern times, foreigners or minorities have faced similar suspicion. Humanity too often repeats the same pattern, choosing blame when knowledge fails. In this, the cruelty of the past lingers uncomfortably in the present. Art also carries the memory forward. The danse macabre, with its skeletal procession, has its heirs in modern works that grapple with mortality. Songs, films, and writings echo the medieval habit of turning fear into expression. Just as frescoes once warned of death's universality, we now create symbols to remind ourselves of fragility and resilience. The human need to translate grief into creation remains unchanged, binding centuries together. Medical progress has changed the battlefield, yet it has not erased the struggle. Where once herbs and incense filled the air, today vaccines and antibiotics stand in their place. Still, the uncertainty, the waiting, and the loss remain familiar. Physicians of the Middle Ages wrote with trembling hands of symptoms they could not cure. Modern doctors, too, have faced moments where knowledge falters. In both ages, the struggle is waged between human hope and the unseen. I often reflect on how medieval suffering fostered resilience. People lived with death close at hand, yet they continued to build, to trade, to sing, and to pray. In our own trials, we mirror that persistence, carrying on amid uncertainty. The fire that once consumed monasteries and villages did not extinguish life, it transformed it. So too do our present trials push us to adapt, to rethink, and to endure. The past is not distant, but alive in us. Even the language of illness carries medieval roots. Quarantine, lazaretto, pestilence. These words still shape how we speak of disease. They are fragments of an age long gone, yet they remind us that every response we make is built upon foundations laid by those who suffered before. Their endurance paved the way for ours. Their sorrows became our inheritance. To speak these words is to acknowledge their memory. The echoes of medieval epidemics live on because they reveal a truth unchanged. Humanity is fragile, yet unyielding. The centuries between then and now have not erased fear, nor have they dimmed resilience. Around our fires today, just as in the past, we tell stories to give meaning to what we cannot control. In remembering their struggles, we find strength for our own, bound across time by the common thread of survival.